Shakespeare once wrote in King Lear that the stars above us govern our conditions. It makes one wonder, though, who should govern the stars themselves. In the year 2424, humanity was on the brink of a new interstellar era. The Earth, center of an interplanetary empire of almost 300 billion, was beginning to send out more and more interstellar arc ships every year. Indeed, the nations of the Great Mediterranean Economic Alliance had agreed to fund and send a colony fleet of their own every Summer Olympic game, and the selection of the senior crew and colony leaders was almost as big of news as who won the gold medal in swimming that year, a shocking contestant from Hesperides, the twilight sky city that floats on the day-night terminator of Venus, and where the only pool on Venus exists, and not a large one at that. Maxwell Augustine had the honor of awarding that prize as a publicity event to also celebrate his appointment to be the planetary governor of New Actium, the chosen name for the planet the GMA would be sending its Olympic fleet to, carrying tens of thousands of colonists, and which was set to launch before the year's end. Maxwell, or Max to his friends, was a seasoned administrator and visionary and was appointed as the governor of a new planetary colony, destined for the world of New Actium. He would ride on board the Navas Longa, the flagship of the fleet, and a massive generation arc ship designed to traverse the vast stretches of interstellar space. Maxwell was a man of principle, diplomacy, and resolve, traits that would be tested as he navigated the complex dynamics of a society in transit. He had served in many roles overseeing far larger populations, from metropolitan mayor to arcology administrator to chief of staff for a major cabinet official. At age 74, he was approaching the peak of his career, and some of his peers wondered why he would take an effective exile to a location over a century away. While others understood it all too well, he wanted to build something and lead a new land of enthusiastic people forging a future among the stars. He immediately hit it off with Admiral Agrippa and his flag captain for the Navas Longa, Marcia Antony. The colonists were enthusiastic, both those boarding to spend the trip awake and those who would spend it on ice. Max tried to meet as many of those colonists going on ice as he could in advance, since he would not see them again until after their arrival at New Actium. While spirits were high when they departed the orbital docks above Earth, Max didn't have many illusions that the trip would be all fun and games. Everyone knew the pioneering work at New Actium would be hard, but the journey to New Actium was expected to last several decades, and the governance of the ship's population, a microcosm of Earth's own, required a delicate balance of leadership and diplomacy. Having read many briefs on the problems colony ships often had, including the autobiographical account of the legendary Emily Poole, chief engineer of the colony ship Francis Bailey, he knew to expect the unexpected. Thankfully, he had good support from both the colonists on his ship and its siblings and the crew, led by Admiral Agrippa and Captain Antony. They were good allies and fondly called by the folks on the Navas Longa the 3 M's, Max, Mark, and Marcia. It was their shared good leadership that let them hold the fleet together through many early problems, particularly the Ganymede defection. Their small fleet was mostly focused on the settlement of the planet of New Actium, or New Actium Prime, the name for the planet and system still being debated after launch. But the folks on board the ship Ganymede's Hand were something of outsiders. It was generally accepted policy that the settlement of a new system was best accomplished by establishing early bases at some icy moon or dwarf planet in the new system, to provide fuel, propellant, and volatiles for the development of that system's space infrastructure and habitats, which would often be vital to terraforming new planets in addition to allowing an interplanetary and interstellar economy. Ganymede's Hand was the ship tasked with that mission, and unlike most of the rest of the colonists who generally came from Earth and the Mediterranean region, its people were largely spacers from the moons of Jupiter, particularly Ganymede. While they got along well enough with the rest of the fleet, they saw themselves as a separate enterprise, and more so as the trip progressed. During the flight, word reached the fleet that an interstellar rogue planet, an icy dwarf previously claimed by another settlement group had become open because the group in question had dissolved. It was a minor but viable detour for the fleet, and the captain of Ganymede's Hand, Jane Cormier, was confident they could claim it first, refuel the fleet, and proceed to New Actium, and that the law would support their claim. Possession is 9/10 the law, they say, and this is very true of deep space interstellar settlements, as it may take decades to even find out about a claim and more to dispute it legally. And actually sending some sort of expedition to dislodge or seize control of an illegal settlement would generally be a legal, military, and diplomatic nightmare for very little gain. Governor Augustine and Admiral Agrippa both declined, saying it would add needless risk to the mission, delay it by at least a decade, and that it would lose vital equipment and personnel needed for settling New Actium. While the captain of Ganymede's Hand agreed to set the matter aside, many on that ship demanded a fleet vote on the matter, even if polling showed it opposed by a wide margin, and when it was refused, used that as an excuse to declare them tyrants, and led a mutiny against the captain and turn Ganymede's Hand away from the fleet onto a new course for that dwarf planet, which they believed would be an invaluable hub of interstellar travel and commerce in centuries to come. One of the other ships opened fire on them, and while neither was critically damaged by the exchange, the event left a permanent scar on the psyche and morale of the fleet. But while the public unity of the 3Ms held the fleet together through the event, it caused cracks in the friendship of the trio. The Admiral was very in favor of fleet unity and declined to court-martial the captain of the ship that had fired on Ganymede's Hand, even though that action severed communication between them and negotiation for some exchange of equipment and personnel that Governor Augustine had been working on quietly to ensure an amicable separation that would not endanger the mission. The captain of the Navas Longa, Captain Antony, was a career spacefarer who spent most of her early career on the Jupiter-Mars run and had originally been slated to be the captain of Ganymede's Hand before the Admiral selected her as his flag captain, and knew most of their senior crew well. And while she agreed with the governor about the court-martial for the captain who fired on Ganymede's Hand, Captain Antony was a stark contrast to Maxwell, prioritizing the mechanics of the journey and the efficiency of the ship over the social dynamics of its passengers. This difference in priorities led to their first major conflict, arising over resource allocation in the aftermath of Ganymede's Hand leaving with most of their refining equipment and a disproportionately large share of their fuel, since they had expected to oversee and fuel the many smaller ships that would scout and establish outposts throughout the system when they arrived. Captain Anthony insisted on diverting more resources to the ship's propulsion systems, arguing that they had little reserves now and needed to begin rationing. Maxwell, however, argued that such a shift would reduce life support and agricultural capabilities, directly impacting the welfare of the colonists and limiting the ability to continue growing their population. Much of the passengers who were awake spent a lot of their free time building habitat extensions on the ships and raising families. The standoff grew tense, drawing the crew and colonists into factions, which were also divided by ship. Many of the colonists were already frozen for the journey, and the decision to begin rationing encouraged many others to freeze themselves for the remainder of the trip, which resulted in the crew making up a much larger percentage of the awake population of the fleet than previously. Adding to the complexity was Admiral Agrippa. He understood Maxwell's concerns but often found himself mediating between the governor and the captains of the other vessels were increasingly having conflicts with passenger elements, and Agrippa almost invariably sided with them, as unlike on his ship, these elements were usually not being led by the elected governor, and indeed some had broken formal charter to start electing mayors for a ship. This had been mostly ignored for the sake of smoothing things over, but none were using the same system. For instance, on one ship, the ship mayor might be elected by a majority of the crew and passengers, and this was most common, and it wasn't unusual for the captain to be that mayor, whereas other ships explicitly forbid the captain or any of the ship's crew from serving as mayor. Some used an elected council, on which the ship's captain held a position. On one ship, only the passengers could vote for mayor, and the crew and passengers were very separated, whereas on two others, passengers going on ice could give their vote to another person as proxy. and as a result, some people held dozens of votes individually. And on one ship, they began openly using those votes as their basis for their internal economy that arose to get around rationing, using nanovote tokens for trade. Almost every ship had its black and gray markets, and these caused no end of headaches for Governor Augustine over the decades, especially as the Admiral was strongly opposed to any acceptance of such trade or unofficial currencies, even while various currency and barter systems sprung up everywhere and became regular gambling tokens among card games of even very senior crew members. Under the charter, Governor Augustine could not be removed during the voyage from his role except by a supermajority of all the charter signatories, every adult passenger or crew member who agreed to remain awake for the voyage. Once they arrived in system and people woke up, that would change, but during the voyage, with many going to sleep for the remainder of the voyage, it was doubtful if he could even be removed. And that was a matter that they had sent back to Earth for guidance for, and between light lag and legal debate, it was deemed unlikely they would get an answer before they arrived at New Actium anyway. This caused a lot of passengers and crew born on the trip to question his legitimacy, which many of the more power-hungry mayors and other civic leaders often stirred the pot about. Since the Admiral could only be removed by a supermajority vote of the other captains, he similarly was unlikely to be replaced, and both he and the Governor, despite their growing differences, publicly support each other's legitimacy and legal claims, while privately, both were slowly losing control of the fleet. On one ship, for instance, after a mutiny killed the captain, his appointed replacement and the one elected by the crew eventually declared themselves co-captains. In response to this and other growing concerns, Captain Anthony and the Admiral's Chief of Staff both argued that all critical colony files, such as data archives, manufacturing schematics, and 3D printers' standard template construct files, should be placed under a proverbial lock and key, encrypted and restricted to captains to prevent further mutinies. Eventually, in spite of the Governor's protests, the Admiral agreed and enacted the provision, though stopped short of declaring martial law. This had the effect of calming much of the problems on the fleet. It was less that cooler heads prevailed, as cool anger and frosty relationships became the norm throughout the expedition. By the time the fleet arrived in their destination system, every ship was practically its own separate nation, with at least one ship vowing to turn back to Earth as soon as it could refuel, offload those colonists who wanted to stay, and load anyone else wanting to return. Privately, the Admiral confided to the Governor, with whom he had developed something of a frenemy relationship, that he planned to board that ship and return to Earth on ice, having no desire to continue trying to hold the remnants of the fleet leadership together. Maxwell seriously considered doing the same. The Admiral's Chief of Staff, a staunch loyalist of the Admiral's, declined the promotion to Vice Admiral, and Captain Anthony had already made it clear that she and a few of the other captains planned to take much of the fleet onto new systems after helping establish the colony, so it was unclear who would be taking over the role of commander of the system's defenses once the colonial charter asserted control, which officially would take place when the Governor planted the flag on New Actium. As a result of this, the escort ships that accompanied the Governor's shuttle down to New Actium were hardly ceremonial, as fleet security had gotten wind of at least a dozen different groups planning to interfere with the flag planting. As is, it was almost 2 years between when the fleet officially entered the system and when the Governor landed on New Actium. Most of the original passengers still remained on ice, as resources were still scarce, as orbital hydroponics was still being set up, slowed by a lack of off-world volatiles, and major groundside dome farming was years off, and in any event, those frozen colonists were now outnumbered by those born during the trip. This left Maxwell with a scattered and uneasy coalition, and even many of his supporters only maintained that support in order to expedite the colony to the point that the colonial charter would expire, as his role as planetary governor and de facto system governor would only last until certain settlement benchmarks were achieved, with the most important being that the settlement should be in a position to vote on a new constitution with no less than 10 million adults voting by majority for its ratification to replace the colonial charter. As is, settlement was hampered by diverse factions going their own way, at least in part, and settling on various different continents and islands on New Actium's surface, as well as various moon and asteroid colonies, often ignoring or violating land deeds and claims made under the Charter. New Actium itself was a planet with a similar ocean-to-land ratio as Earth, but its atmosphere was mostly nitrogen and carbon dioxide, and somewhat warmer than Earth as well, with a 26-hour day and gravity 5% higher than Earth's standard. This made it relatively easy to terraform as these things go, which was mostly beneficial but also made it easier for factions to go their own way, and several did, leaving a coalition government of loosely aligned factions under Governor Maxwell's control when the majority of the fleet departed under Admiral Antony's command for a new system. They had only remained long enough to resupply, attract some colonists who wished to join them, and because Maxwell had offered his official and legal support to them if they agreed to remain for a time. Admiral Agrippa had refused to appoint a replacement fleet admiral, saying he had no such authority with the colony established, and had quietly departed to Earth shortly after the flag planting. When Agrippa awoke from his journey home to Earth, he found Maxwell had been sending him regular letters, updates, and concerns, a fast forward of events that included arguments between terraforming factions on how to reshape New Actium, his gubernatorial mansion narrowly avoiding being destroyed when a nuke was smuggled inside, then later half of it being destroyed when a rogue system defense boat launched an orbital strike on the capital city of Nova Roma, the surprise arrival of Ganymede's hand in system, wishing to re-establish friendly ties, and finally, his plans for early retirement, when the combined system's adult population had hit 10 million, even though they had previously been arguing that only the coalition's population, at more like 5 million, should count toward that total. The last letter in the stack included a copy of the newly ratified Constitution, on which he was the first signatory, a copy of the election results for his replacement some months later, and a picture of the now green seas as taken from orbit many decades after he first landed, before he departed on Ganymede's hand, where he planned to visit the colony in deep space they had established after leaving the fleet, and then perhaps to return home to Earth. Shortly after his departure, a statue of him holding an ever-burning torch aloft would be erected in the capital, a testament to his bold and Olympic efforts to light a path forward to the future. It would be torn down some decades later when history viewed him less kindly, but in 2924, the first Olympic Games would be held on New Actium, and a torch lit from that torch of the statue, which had survived its destruction. Admiral Agrippa suspected his longtime friend would have found that event amusing, but he was never able to find out, as no word or record of Governor Augustine ever reached him after his departure on Ganymede's hand. When drafting this episode, I tried to think of what the qualifications for a planetary governor of a new colony would be, and was stymied by the realization that whoever was elected to lead the colonists on their way out from Earth would probably not be who they chose when the settlement got its feet under it some decades after arrival. Needless to say, it couldn't be, even if they spent the whole trip on ice without some serious extension in lifespan, which we take for granted in the story today. I could only see it occurring if that person was basically considered a hero by all, so they just kept getting re-elected over and over to the point it was a formality, which was in my mind when I picked the name for the various characters in the tale and fabricated its fictional future history. I'd imagine our history buffs caught the many references to the late Roman Republic, and it and the handful of other governments that lasted reasonably stably for multiple centuries were on my mind when contemplating how you would keep a colony together for centuries and far from any tangible support or enforcement from Earth, which probably had major shifts in its own culture and government in that time too. I'd originally planned to write more about the time after they landed, but in the end it became more of an epilogue, or perhaps we could view the story more as a prologue for our discussion for the rest of the episode. I find myself trying to create obstacles to travel. How do I crash this ship, so to speak? And in many cases the technical ones fall away fairly easily, while the people ones do not. As an example, Ganymede's hand departing our colony fleet and carrying with it a lot of the folks who specialized in mining icy bodies and asteroids and had the equipment on it, and a lot of the reserve fuel is a real crisis for a fleet. But you would always have had enough fuel to slow each ship on each vessel. So the lack of reserves is painful for growth and safety, but not a genuine threat to survival. So too, when you have decades of flight time remaining, training up people to take over the task and repurpose or recycling materials into the necessary equipment is not too challenging. Technical survival, while everyone is working together, is honestly basically never the problem, as you have the forethought to prepare for most natural challenges and crises, and your unity of purpose and fraternity of the group in general is going to get you through it. Rather, it's the degeneration of that unity and fraternity that's going to cause problems. I envision the ship firing on Ganymede's hand during their desertion of the fleet as something like an escalation of a warning shot or a petulant slap that got a bit out of hand, rather than a genuine attempt to kill them, and a breakdown in morale as people agreed with that sentiment, but some clearly viewed it as illegal and couldn't decide on if they could ignore it or should ignore it, while others began wondering if that might happen to them, either attacked for disobedience or used as a scapegoat if they crossed the line. A very human sort of chain of events in a world where they're all genuine villains and heroes, but mostly they are just regular good people, mostly with good intentions, but also rather self-centered in their views and interpretations of the events around them. So you have a big drive to maintain that unity of purpose, but disagreement on how much there needs to be and on what. Yeah, we need to stick to the plan on most things, but we need to be willing to adapt too. Few folks believe all change is bad, or that we should casually make any change, even those that seem pretty sound, without considering secondary effects and problems that might result. It's just that we tend to disagree about how urgent a change is, how bad the secondary effects might be, and if a given change is even a good one or not. I would not expect that to change much in the future, nor would expect us to ever be short of folks who either deeply believed in a cause or were simply opportunistic scumbags willing to pull the strings on folks and rile up problems. So we see lower-ranking officers in the fleet and emerging leaders of various groups among the colonists start jockeying for power and riling up bad sentiments. There's also no protagonist-centered morality going on here. Our planetary governor is a good man with some manipulative tendencies and a certain conviction he's the right man to solve problems. We never mention any of his personal subordinates because he never really delegates power to them. He's very confident in his own skills and less in those of others. He has no succession plan because he's not planning to die and is laser focused on that eventual constitutional ratification as his own retirement. Our fleet admiral is likewise an honorable man, but one willing to get very heavy-handed about maintaining order. Our flag captain mostly backs her superior's calls, but increasingly thinks she could do things better and has an autocratic streak. Lastly, our fleet chief of staff desires no personal recognition and thus isn't even seen as the fourth leg of that triumvirate of power, and is hyper-loyal to the admiral and the mission, but willing to be underhanded and ruthless in those pursuits. All were utterly dedicated to getting the colonists safely there and established as a free, prosperous, and democratic splinter of humanity, and it wouldn't be hard to imagine things going much worse if that dedication had wavered or been false. And that's just the run-up to getting to the colony, and the three fleet characters are essentially secondary, since it's the planetary governor we're interested in, except to note how easily a ship captain of a colony vessel or its admiral might end up as the planetary governor, whatever a piece of paper assigned 100 light-years away and centuries earlier said. Why is our planetary governor overconfident? Well, there's no saying he was, but he was picked for a high-profile role that was much more high-profile than the actual population size he was governing probably justifies. Since he has access to life extension, he is only getting more skillful and experienced with time too, so he doesn't have to be urgently thinking about training a successor. He has an established relationship with every other competent administrator who came on board, who were also probably pretty overqualified for the size of the actual department, and they were all getting better and probably not retiring much either. so I'm not thinking they feel a need to retire or pass the reins on to some energetic and clever new pupil who arose from their much smaller recruitment pool on board than the huge collection of nations that funded and fueled their expedition, from which they were selected as the cream of the crop. You think of some hypothetical forced Martian colony founded by a few hundred folks, and who gets to be in charge of that, and imagine how heavy the competition would be and how stunning the resumes would need to look to win that, while keeping in mind that it's fewer people than your typical small-town mayor has for their citizenry. They are likely to have been the poster boy for excellence, and indeed might have all their citizens selected on similarly stringent qualifications, but even so, it doesn't strike me as the sorts of folks prone to humility or self-doubts. Indeed, I can't imagine anyone prone to a lot of self-doubts ever being placed in charge of a distant colony or outpost like that. At least not until those are so many in number they stop being prestigious and instead become a good place to exile troublemakers. My home county of Ashtabula, population 100,000, is almost exactly average for population size for one of America's 3,000 counties that subdivide our 50 states. It has 27 townships, mostly big 5x5 mile squares left over from when Ohio divided its parcels out, 10 municipalities in those townships, 7 villages of less than 5,000 each, 3 cities of more than 5,000. That's the official delineation between village and city in Ohio. I tried to picture each of those as some random domed city or scattered collection of individual domed households over a large island like Ireland, or an asteroid or moon base. I know most of our villages' mayors or managers and township trustees, along with a lot of the village and city council members and school board members, and all the county officials. I certified them to be legally on the ballot and signed their certificate verifying they won their election. I know what sort of issues they have running their communities, the challenges and limitations of their powers, and how often isolated they feel they are from help or sympathy. I know many of them well and count many close friends. I even married one of them. And they as a group range in talent from dim-witted or petty to brilliant or virtuous, and I try to picture us as a wider community dumped across a barren planet. I invite you to try to do the same, whether it's your community or your company or school, and try to imagine that transplant going on. All of you dumped across the surface of an entire planet, and an entirely desolate one at that. In this case, you are equipped for the mission. You didn't just magically appear on some godforsaken rock a trillion miles from home, and you mostly all believe in that mission too, but it still isn't hard to see how quickly various factions and opposing ideas would emerge. You go a bit south in my county and it turns all into forests and farms, and people who moved there did so because that lifestyle appealed to them. But it might not have appealed to their spouse as much as to them, or to their kids. Some of those kids gladly embraced that life and revel in it even more than their parents or grandparents did. Others can't wait to get the heck out of that podunk town and see the big city or the world. But even for those second and third and fourth generations who embrace that lifestyle, their vision of how that community should look are not the same as their parents or their neighbors, and I should imagine this is true in every town, rural or suburb, up to the biggest metropolis, from my hometown to the most distant corner of the world. But if any are different, then I can only think the pioneers on the distant frontier, and often far from their neighbors, are not terribly likely to feel that they need to work together to achieve some grand compromise of a planetary vision. And that's sort of where I see our planetary governor having to handle things, because in a sparsely populated and sparsely settled new world, herding cats is probably the kindest and most unified description of what's going on. On New Actium, I said at the end that our governor left to see green seas from above. I assumed the planet was dead and ocean covered to begin with, but they released a lot of tailored microorganisms to start converting sunlight, water, and carbon dioxide into sugar and free oxygen. As slow as terraforming is, if you got microorganisms that can survive there decently, it really will cover that planet in a few decades. Especially if you're giving a hand transplanting itself everywhere. Such being the case, who actually decided when and what to release? I mean, we assume the properly appointed terraforming chief and the lead microbiologist asked the governor, who nodded and then got it rolling. But what if they've been in disagreement about when and how to start that? how hard would it be for one of the test samples to get lost or accidentally spilled, and now the planet is getting green gooed? And the place is huge, so even with tens of thousands of folks on it, how many places could a determined terraformer infect before someone noticed it directly or on a satellite photo? It's not like they're going to be evenly spread out, tens of thousands of folks, but probably clustered in groups of tens or thousands. Who decides where the seas go, the cities go, when that first free election should get held? Is it for a new governor, or is it at the smaller scale? They keep their chief executive slot, but start letting every small station, outpost, or domed village hold elections for mayor. And note that I'm assuming democracy is in play here, and it is not hard to imagine that getting lost on the journey or after arrival. Nor should we take for granted these colony fleets are being sent out by modern democratic nations. After all, using a lot of colonial governors for examples, they might be there by appointment of their monarch, or represent the leader of a religious faction that might be an outright theocracy, or their ship captain and crew took over and they've been under a military junta ever since. We can hardly say they are doomed to failure either. All of the above have fairly impressive track records for carving out new empires successfully. The one thing they all have in common, barring the invention of FTL or superluminal travel, is that they are on their own, and they started that way not on arrival, but from the moment of departure. And while I've been focusing a lot on the human element, that's what our Life on a or Life as a types of episodes tend to focus on, let's not overlook the sheer difficulty of the actual environment. Just as an example, if I've got a few people scattered all over a hostile planet, with more scattered around an undeveloped star system, one of my biggest challenges daily is setting up an effective force of first responders, which is likely to seriously use up resources even if it's an all-volunteer force. That communication grid is a nightmare too, because even if we assumed a whole civilization there could survive on a constellation of maybe 40 satellites around that planet, if you've only got the 10,000 or so folks most science fiction space colonies I've seen tend to have, that's 250 people per satellite. We are obviously assuming they have a much easier time deploying and maintaining those than we do now, but much easier might mean they each only cost a few $1,000s a year to build and maintain, not millions. How much of your effort as a pioneer colony is spent just building those and building domes, on a planet where even a log cabin isn't possible because there's no trees, and their air would all get sucked out between the timbers if there were? There's no power grid unless maybe you have a solar satellite in orbit beaming down power to the rectenna by each habdome, which you might. On some quarter planets you might need to beam in sunlight to warm spots early on. How about water or sewer? There's no cool, refreshing mountain creek to sip from. How about schools? It's hard to imagine a pioneer community being able to devote one adult to every 10 or 20 kids, though a more automated society might be able to do even better, and unless everyone is all in the same place, it's probably going to require going back to the old one-room schoolhouse approach a lot, which, thinking of some of my friends who are teachers, I suspect would both fascinate and horrify them as an option. Is it all online? Maybe. I homeschool my kids with help of pre-recorded classes. It is not easy or a tiny commitment of time, but it is not as time-consuming as I suspect most folks would expect. A full-time teacher needs to be a pro and have several hours a day because they're trying to teach a whole ton of kids at once, not a few, and herd those kittens into a semblance of good behavior while about it. But a high-tech culture can't skimp on education or it's going to lose its tech base pretty quick, and it's already going to have a ton of supply chain issues, since in a population of 10,000, you can probably only afford 10 or 20 people who build cell phones or laptops. A lot is dependent on the technology you've got available, and if you're trying to stay in power, even as an autocrat, people have to be fairly okay with the job you're doing, and they won't stay that way long if you aren't providing those emergency services, those educations, and those stable communication lines for phone and internet. And again, the initial folks who left might have been all excited about the pioneering life and self-reliance, but they may not all have stayed that way, and their kids and grandkids might not feel the same. Of course, a planetary governor might have access to brainwashing technologies, or by interstellar isolation, be able to break out a lot of dangerous or banned technologies to help maintain their rule. I also don't think we should take for granted that a planet stays unified for long under one government, or that a star system would be either. In our example, we eventually had a coalition that made up about half the system population, and the rest in smaller communities ranging from lone individuals to modestly small nations, and who made it clear that they will continue in unity for expediency and tradition's sake. If we imagined all Earth's population was just 10 million, which is barely 1,000th what it currently is, then your closest things to centers of civilization might be a couple dozen cities scattered across that planet, and entirely content to claim fraternity because it's convenient for trading restless young folks around, maintaining sports teams, and having some specialized trade in manufacturing, but they probably don't feel much obligation to work together on internal policy much. Now, as that population grows, which it might do very quickly if you've got life extension technology and pioneer families set on big families, if things have stayed unified, then your planetary governor is very likely to wield more power than any Roman emperor ever did, or Caliph, or Genghis Khan, or Kublai Khan, or Queen Victoria, or any of the other rulers of mighty empires at their prime. And they would be in a good position to achieve the title of system governor too, because there are only going to be a handful of major planets, and power is likely to centralize to them, even in Kardashev II societies. And we should remember that a colony like this could easily double its numbers twice a century, like we did in the 20th century, and so a colony that begins with even just 10,000 people gets to 10 million in 500 years, 10 billion in 500 more, and would be full K2 in 2,500 years if that rate continued. Just the nature of travel in a no-FTL universe means a system governor is essentially the peak of the food chain. There's no one to really report up to who is going to respond in under a decade and who realistically can enforce much on you. With the possible exception of a star cluster, which might be able to have a unified leader, as those pack hundreds of stars in a tiny space. And while we certainly pointed out the difficulties of trying to maintain power over decades, it is worth noting there are a lot of advantages working in your favor in that role. With advanced life extension, you don't get old and tired or senile, you get more skilled and more influential, and all your friends of youth are doing the same, and it gets harder to rock the boat in some ways because everyone is very comfortable on it. I honestly doubt we'll ever see a planetary governor outside this solar system who didn't have access to radical life extension, as I do expect that technology inside the next century or so. I love space opera, even if I don't think it paints a very realistic look at life in the future, but to use it as an example, if we were imagining a planetary governor with a planetary population of 10 billion, then their economy is almost certainly at least an order of magnitude bigger than our modern one, if not a lot more. They probably could keep a force of at least 100 million soldiers and sailors on full-time pay even in peacetime, and likely would have thousands of megatons of nukes at their disposal, likely with interplanetary capability, along with doomsday weapons that scoffed at those as little more than firecrackers. They probably have at least a few hundred million more employees, ranging from bureaucrats to law enforcement. And if they have a Congress or Senate or Parliament built along typical modern lines, each of those representatives probably represents 10 million people or more. They may be feudal or aristocratic too, with family allies and great houses of barons and dukes and counts that have been around for centuries, or even had the same family leader for centuries. They may command fleets of thousands of capital ships and regularly oversee megaprojects like turning deserts green or thawing out polar regions. And that's without even contemplating the sorts of planets we look at in our episode's hive worlds or cosmic capitals. Or they might govern the other types of specialized planets we consider in that series, like farming planets, industrial forge worlds, fortress planets, and more. They might be one world with a handful of off-planet space habitats and asteroid colonies, where their power is unchallenged and covers everyone except the occasional interstellar spaceship arriving for trade, or one of several major planets in a colonized system of thousands of minor planets, which they might occasionally go to war with, or even the crown jewel of a glittering Dyson swarm. Much like the mayor of a small village compared to the mayor of one of the largest cities, there's a wide spread in scale, and just as wide a scale in relative power available. You might be a figurehead or an absolute ruler who reigned undisputedly and totally for millennia. You might be a planet in a system like Alpha Centauri near some greater power like Earth, or some isolated colony on the edge of the galaxy, or even in extragalactic space. Your colony might be a primitive and low-tech one, or a techno-barbarian feudal one where the knights of the era storm around in giant mecha. Or it might be some immense digital world lived in virtual space, or some cyborg civilization. Indeed, you might not be very human yourself, but some rarely seen superhuman sitting on a golden throne, or some post-human mind of vast and inhuman scope ruling over some civilization of regular humans. As an interesting note to close on though, if the idea of being a planetary governor appeals to you, and if life extension does roll out in our lifetimes, you may very well have an opportunity to apply for and get that job, given that there are almost 100 times as many star systems out there as there are people alive now, and most will have multiple planets around them we might settle on. So who knows, one day you might be planting a flag on a strange new world, and getting big statues of you built there too. Whether or not they stayed up long would, of course, depend on how good a job you did in your life as a planetary governor. As we saw today, there's a lot involved in trying to run a space colony, where you need everything from leadership and administrative skills to a solid understanding of multiple STEM disciplines. That's true of ever more workplaces too, and if you're looking to move forward in a career in or around STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math, then there's no time like the present to enhance your own knowledge of those areas, and that's where Brilliant.org can help. Brilliant's been a partner to this show for most of a decade now, and shares my commitment to fun and intuitive learning approaches, and you can trust them to be your partner on the road to learning. Build real knowledge in minutes a day, with fun lessons you can do whenever you have the time. Learn through problem solving and doing, with hands-on interactive content that's fun, immersive, effective, and intuitive. Brilliant.org's content goes from the basics, all the way up to advanced materials on math, science, data, probability, computers, and AI. Start where you need to, and go as far as your dreams can take you. You can try everything Brilliant has to offer for free for a full 30 days. Just visit brilliant.org/IsaacArthur or click on the link in the description. You'll also get 20% off an annual premium subscription. So today we migrated to another world, and next week we'll continue discussing migration as we return to the topic of the Fermi Paradox on August 8th to consider how migration to the galactic core, or rim, or other universes might explain the Great Silence. Then it'll be time for Sci-Fi Sunday as we examine the popular notion from sci-fi that humans might have been uplifted by distant visitors or some more ancient civilizations native to Earth. Then we'll be back to the here and now on August 15th to look at what the next technological revolution will be. If you'd like to get alerts when those and other episodes come out, make sure to hit the like, subscribe, and notification buttons. You can also help support the show by becoming a member here on YouTube or Patreon, or check out other ways to help at isaacarthur.net. You can also catch all of SFA's episodes early and ad-free on our streaming service Nebula, along with hours of bonus content like Jupiter Brains and Megaminds at go.nebula.tv/IsaacArthur. As always, thanks for watching, and have a great week.